All right, it's time for another update and forecast on the fires in Southern California. We'll look at the Palisades fire, the Eaton fire, and then we'll also look at, obviously, the red flag warning, which is actually more of the critical part of this forecast than what's going on with the fires. And just to drive that point home, if we look at the acreage and containment, it might still look like this is a fire that we should be very worried about. 23,000 acres, that's a very large fire, especially for January. 18% containment, that doesn't seem all that high. But I show those numbers just to then say that those numbers don't really mean all that much, because what we really care about is how active have the fires been recently, and do we expect them to flare back up again, and did any new fires start today with those very gusty winds that we had. And we'll even look at some of the weather stations on the ground to see how windy it did get today. And then finally, we'll look at the weather forecast to see how windy it might get in the future. So here's the Palisades fire. I mentioned 18% containment. I take that number with a grain of salt, but if you want to see where the containment is, it's where that black line is. So that's the fire perimeter. Red is going to be where they're technically saying it's uncontained. Black is where that 18% of our fire perimeter comes from. But the reason that I'm sort of taking that with a grain of salt is if we look at the fire progression here, It was quite active, especially on Saturday. This northeastern side started threatening Mandeville Canyon over here on the eastern side, where you can see it pushes right up to where we have a lot of these structures in here. They highlight in 3D once I zoom in enough. You can see how close the fire perimeter got to those. And amazing work done by all the resources on this fire to keep this fire from going through those structures. And it's actually crucial that they did stop it right there, because fire likes to travel uphill. So if it had gone to the base of this canyon right here, it would have been very easy for it to run up the other side. And then the next place they would have most likely been able to stop it would have been the 405. So all of these structures in here would have been in danger. And then we also had a little slop over on the northern side here, where it went over that road that they used for the firing operation, but we haven't seen that move much in the last couple of days, and honestly, we haven't seen the fire at all move over the last couple of days. The last spot that was, I would say, the most critical situation on Saturday was this little southern portion right here on the east, where once again bumps right up to those structures, and amazingly, they were able to stop it in its tracks. And I'd say this one was even more amazing because we had some northerly winds trying to push this fire into these structures, and on Saturday this spot looked fairly active. So pretty amazing work done right there. So that's our fire perimeter. It really hasn't moved in the last few days, and the proof for that is if we go over to the heat detections here. There's the Palisades fire, and we zoom in here. Normally it only looks like that when I have perimeters only clicked on. And then typically when I switch to modus and veers here, that's going to pick up on the hot spots. And in the past, if you've been watching my videos throughout the coverage for these wildfire events, let's say on Saturday, we had red stars all over this northeastern section because that's where the fire was very active in the last 12 hours. And then we had some yellow stars throughout the rest of the fire. But right now, we're not seeing any of those stars, which means there hasn't been enough heat coming off of this fire in over 2 days for the satellites to even be able to pick up on that heat. Obviously, there's still some smoldering areas, and that's what the crews are going in there and mopping up, and that is the reason that containment is still listed at 18%, because there's a lot of work that has to be done even after the fire has been extremely active. They have to go in there and basically what's called mop up to make sure it doesn't flare back up again. And when you have winds like what we had today, that is very important work. The main point I'm trying to make, though, is that you look at a number like 18% or 23,000 acres, and it would be easy to think that this fire's in a very bad position. But if you look at the heat activity that's been on it, there's been none. If we look at the satellite imagery to see if there's any smoke, you can't even really tell where the fires are because I haven't seen smoke on that since Saturday, and it's now Tuesday. So the fires are looking great in terms of the fact that they didn't flare back up with those winds that we had. Now let's actually get into the weather forecast, though, because that's where it's not completely good news. I'd say it is good news that we got through what was supposed to be the worst part of this forecast, which was overnight last night into early this morning, without any fires, new fires starting, and without the previous fires like Palisades, Kenneth, or Eaton, without those flaring back up. So dodged a bullet there, I would say. With that being said, though, we do still have the particularly dangerous situation shown in purple, and they have that in place Wednesday 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. And I like how specific they get with the times right there. Notice if you zoom in even more, the PDS, which is shown in the purple, that's going to be where your most critical wildfire conditions are, your gustiest winds, your driest, your lowest relative humidity. Notice that is outside of the Palisades fire, but it does get fairly close to that western edge, and then it does cover the northern half of the Eaton fire. At this point, though, the fact that the fires didn't flare back up again today that's not that big of a worry for me at this point. I'd say my bigger worry would be maybe some new fires starting at this point, because they've got a lot of crews making sure these fires don't flare back up again. So with that being said, we see the timing right there, 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. Before we get into the weather forecast, though, I do want to just look at some of those winds that we had overnight last night and what we currently have right now. So these are actual weather stations on the ground, and those red numbers show the winds that we have. So this forecast wasn't overblown by any standards. You look at some of the winds that we have out there right now, these would be somewhat close to the Palisades fire. 37 mile per hour wind. The max wind there today was 47 miles per hour. Meanwhile, minimum relative humidity was 14%. That's about as critical of a weather forecast as you'll often see. And that wasn't even the worst of it. If we go up into the higher elevations up here, it's still gusting around 40 to 46 miles per hour. And the max wind up there today was 61 miles per hour with a minimum relative humidity of 15%. So it makes sense that the National Weather Service called this a particularly dangerous situation, and we'll see if it makes sense for the future. But given what we're seeing right now and what the models were showing yesterday for the future forecast, it makes sense. So before we get into the maps, we can read this. This is the actual incident action plan for the Palisades fire. It's got all sorts of good details in here. For example, some of their control objectives, management objectives, but being a meteorologist, I usually jump straight to the weather discussion. And let's give this a read. So it says, through the operational period, critical fire weather conditions can be expected with gusty north to northeast winds and low relative humidity. It's still going to be windy and dry. Peak gusts between 35 and 55 miles per hour can be expected, with even the possibility of local gusts in excess of 60 miles per hour. It's pretty similar to what we saw maxing out this morning. The strongest winds will occur across the western sections of the fire in Branch 7. So if we want to see where Branch 7 is, we can come back to this map. You see there's Branch 1, there's Branch 7 over here on the west. So that's where they say the windiest conditions are going to be. And that goes along also with the National Weather Service map, where that western side of the fire is awfully close to that particularly dangerous situation. Coming back here, it says relative humidity will drop into the lower to mid-teens with little, if any, recovery tonight. So one thing we'll look at on the map is how much that recovery will be tonight, if there's any moisture moving in. Then it says, with this combination of gusty winds, low humidity, and dry vegetation, the red flag warning will remain in effect through the operational period. So with that being said, let's check out the weather forecast here. So right now, I'd say the model is pretty accurate to what our actual winds are showing some 30 to even 40 mile per hour winds. This is still showing some 30 to 40 mile per hour winds. And then if we click to 10 p.m., looks like they slightly decrease. So that's good news there. Remember, the National Weather Service is saying particularly dangerous situation Wednesday 3 a.m. to 3 p.m. So that's really the time that we're going to be interested in as we click in here. And we'll start that right now. That's going to be 4 a.m. You do start to see the winds pick up a little. And then 7 a.m., it looks like they maybe haven't picked up as much. It just looks like it becomes a bit more widespread. If I click back, you see how there's only those strips covered in the yellow to orangish color. And then when I click forward to 7 a.m., see how that just gets a little bit wider and does push a little bit closer towards the Palisades fire. And then 10 a.m., that's where it looks like the winds really start to pick up. If we go in there, that's going to be your 30 to 40 mile per hour winds. And then if you have terrain like a canyon, that's where it's almost like if you put your thumb over the end of the hose and then it starts coming out faster. So just because that shows 38 mile per hour gusts right there, in localized spots, that's where it goes along with their incident action plans, where you could have local gusts in excess of 60 miles per hour. Although I'd imagine that's more for some of the higher elevations. Although that does look like it'd be close to the western side of the Palisades fire. And where we were reading that is the incident action plan for the Palisades fire. So now let's click into 1 p.m. Actually looks like those very strong winds become more widespread. That's probably the part of the forecast I'm the most worried for as of right now. Let's see, 4 p.m. starts to actually decrease. So I would say 1 p.m. on Wednesday is going to be the most critical time to watch, both in terms of our previous fires flaring back up and new fires starting, because that's a pretty widespread area that has very gusty Santa Ana winds. And then if we look at the relative humidity, 12% is about as low as you're ever going to see on wildfire. Sometimes you can get into the single digits, but when the fuels are already as dry as they are, they're all primed to burn at this point, and they will be until we start to see some moisture move back in there. The one other thing that we wanted to see is the recoveries overnight tonight. So Tuesday, 3 p.m., 7 p.m., 10 p.m. Yeah, notice the relative humidity staying 19%, 20%. That's 4 a.m. tomorrow morning. So really no recovery. We'd like to see that number go up to 60 to 70%, but it's just not happening. So it's staying dry overnight. That means the fuels stay dry, which means when these winds pick up tomorrow afternoon, the fuels are ready to burn. And if any spark does happen, the winds are going to be able to push that fire quickly, provide more oxygen to that fire, and then also pick up burning embers and toss them ahead of the major blaze like what we saw when a lot of these fires popped up the first time. It doesn't, I will say though, if you're comparing this to when the fires first popped up, I wouldn't say this weather forecast looks that bad. So if what's in your mind is, it's going to be just a rerun of what we've already seen as part 2, this is a very critical weather situation, but I don't think it's to that level. Now, let's see if there's any good news in here. If we come back here, it says for Wednesday, the critical fire weather conditions continue into the afternoon hours. That kind of seems to be when it peaks. And then if we start getting into the evening, that's where the winds finally start to calm down. And then that's 1 a.m. Thursday night into Friday. That's some of the calmest winds that we've seen. Excuse me. Sorry, I've been teaching all day, so my voice is a bit tired at this point. But coming back here, it says before diminishing Wednesday evening, peak wind gusts on Wednesday are expected in the 30 to 50 mile per hour range. That's what we saw. Humidity on Wednesday will be a bit lower, dipping into the single digits in some areas. Red flag warning will remain in effect until 6 p.m. on Wednesday. So I'd say Wednesday afternoon looks to be the most critical time of the weather forecast. The peak in winds around 30 to 50 miles per hour, and then also the lowest, the trough in relative humidity, with in some cases dropping into the single digits. But then we do have some good news here. It says for Thursday through the weekend, cooler conditions, higher humidity, and onshore winds are expected. So let's see humidity here as we get into Thursday. Start to see those numbers jump up to 42%. That's maybe the highest I've seen since these fires started. And then over the Palisades fire, that's now Friday 7 a.m., 82%. So some of that moisture is going to find its way into the fuels and I mean, it already looks like the fires are out at this point, but that's going to help even more. So we got to get through tomorrow afternoon and even into tomorrow evening a little bit. But then it looks like there's finally some relief on the way. And I'm sure people will be very happy to hear that. The other thing you should be happy to hear is just how much work they're doing on this. So I wanted to read this because I thought it was somewhat encouraging. The red flag warning will remain in effect with widespread critical fire weather expected through Wednesday evening. That's not what I found encouraging. This is what I found encouraging. Surge resources are pre-positioned in and around the areas of Encino and Malibu in anticipation of the wind event. So they've got resources just waiting there just in case anything flares up so they could stop it before it turns into a blaze that could then kick off burning embers. And then on top of the surge in resources, stage their waiting just in case something happens. They also have infrared flights are being conducted multiple times each day to identify heat pockets within the fire's perimeter. Crews have been assigned to monitor these hotspots continuously and address them as part of mop-up operations. So we're in about as good of hands as we possibly could be. California certainly has a lot of experience with wildfire, so we've got some experts out there. They know what they're doing, and they are putting all the resources on this to make sure the fires don't flare up and also that no new fires start. So big shout out to the over 5,000 personnel that we have on this fire. And then also just thoughts and prayers, as always, go out to everybody who has been impacted by the Palisades fire and all the fires down in Southern California and just all the fires that California's seen over this last decade. Seems like just one after another. So it is up to over 2,000 structures destroyed, although I believe I read they've only done about 30% of the official damage inspections. And if you are local and you haven't been able to go back in yet, which you probably haven't because the fire is not totally safe at this point and they still have the evacuation orders in place, you can use this map to hopefully answer some of those burning questions that you might have of did your house survive? Did it not? This is the damage assessment map, where red means destroyed, black means no damage, and then there's a gradient between those two. In some cases, I mean, if you click in here, it seems like it's absolute luck. In some cases, maybe it came down to fire preparation and how, if they cleaned out their gutters, if they kept brush away from their house, but with the kind of conditions we had on this fire, I think this is one of those fires where it probably is a bit more to do with luck than anything. But if you're a local, you can click in here. You can actually even look at a photo of the area. And I know that that's probably hard to look at, but sometimes it's better to know than to just keep guessing. So that resource is there for you in the link of the description of this video if you're interested in that damage assessment map. And then finally, I've had people ask me about the Eaton fire, and technically that one's still at only 35% containment. But for an even longer time than the Palisades fire, we haven't seen really any heat indications on that. And just like the Palisades fire, they have a ton of resources here mopping up, making sure it doesn't flare back up again. And on the satellite imagery, can't even really tell where the Eaton fire is because there's no smoke coming off of it. So Eaton, Palisades, looking good. Glad to see they didn't flare up with some of those very gusty winds we had this morning. We do still have a critical weather forecast through tomorrow afternoon with that particularly dangerous situation in place. But then after that, it does look like there is some relief finally on the horizon. So I'll do another update tomorrow, but hopefully that will be my last one. And yeah, again, thoughts and prayers go out to everybody who's been impacted by these fires. We just got to get through tomorrow afternoon, and then some of the recovery can start to take place. Thanks for watching.